Genesis 22, Abraham is commanded to take the son that he has received from God, Isaac, the miracle boy, the son born to him when he and his wife were 100 years old. And after his wife had been barren her entire life, that son, Abraham, is commanded by God to take and sacrifice to God. Look with me at Genesis 22, the first verse. And after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. A crushing command by any measure. Horrifying. And so we wonder, what was Abraham thinking? How did he receive this command? What was he feeling? And the remarkable thing about the way Moses tells this story is that we seem not to know very much about what Abraham was thinking. That's not like the other stories with Abraham. Abraham talks to God a lot. He argues with God. He pleads his case. He complains. We know what Abraham was thinking in lots of different circumstances in his life. But after this command is given, all we get is kind of Abraham as played by Gary Cooper, not saying very much. It's all action. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which the Lord had told him. All action, no emotion, no complaining, no expressions whatsoever, just obedience. It's kind of amazing. I wonder if you have ever really looked at those 2 young men. Why did he take them along? It says here that he took, with his donkey, he took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. Why were they needed? All the burden is on the donkey. There's nothing to carry. There is no animal for sacrifice, so this is a very strange journey anyway, but he takes the 2 young men. And then if you think about verse 5, it gets even stranger. In verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. You're going to stay at this spot. Keep watch on the donkey, who was the one carrying all the burdens. So we're going to shift the wood that he's cut for the burnt offering onto Abraham and Isaac, and they're going to go on, and the 2 young men and the donkey are going to stay here. Have you ever thought about this? I want to show you something. I want to show you 3 verbs in this verse. And I want to show you the subject of those verbs. Stay here with the donkey, I and the boy. Here are the 3 verbs. So the subject of these 3 verbs. The boy and I. That's 2 people. Plural. I can math good. Plural subject. I wonder if all of these verbs are plural verbs. Here's the first verb. I and the boy will go over there. Plural verb. We too are going to make this journey over yonder. Second verb. We will go over there, and the boy and I will worship. Plural verb. The 2 of us after we go over there, are going to worship the Lord. And of course, the strange thing about this is that there's no animal for sacrifice. There's just Isaac. Abraham knows what he has been commanded. He has been commanded to sacrifice Isaac on that mountain and offer him up to the Lord as a burnt offering. He knows this. Here's the third verb. The boy and I will go over there, and we will worship and come again to you. Question. That verb, come again, return. Is that singular or plural? I'm asking you, I already know the answer. It's plural. The boy and I is the subject of the three verbs. Go over there, we will worship, and we, the boy and I, will come again to you. What a strange verse. You're left with some alternatives here to explain this verse and what Abraham says at this moment. One explanation is, I know that God told me to sacrifice Isaac, so we are going to go over there and we are going to worship. I'm not going to sacrifice Isaac. I'm going to find something else to sacrifice. We'll do the burnt offering and we will come back to you. Is it likely that that is what Abraham has decided to do? The answer is no. It's not in keeping with his actions or with the story here. He must mean, we will go over there, we will worship as I offer Isaac, my only son, to the Lord, and I take his life, and then we will come back to you. There's only one thing he can mean by that. That Isaac will live even though he has been sacrificed. That is the unquestionable meaning of Genesis 22, verse 5. Unless you want to say that Abraham had no intention of sacrificing Isaac, which is not how the story goes. Question. How could he be so certain? Think of this. God tells you, sacrifice your son. You get all of the equipment ready to do it, and you get two young men, and you station them at a particular spot, and you say, see that, my son there? We are going, and we will return. How did he know? How did he know he was going to come back with Isaac? It seems like he couldn't have known any such thing. It seems like he knew that he would come back alone, and yet he stations witnesses to prove that he left with the boy and returned with the boy. That's the function of these two young men, following the ancient principle that if you want to establish a fact, you need two or more witnesses. This is fascinating. And with that in mind and that question hanging over us of how it was that Abraham knew that he was going to return with Isaac after sacrificing him, with that question in mind, let's return to the passage that Brenda read for us, Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to look at verses 8 through 15. We're talking about the covenant with Abraham all of these weeks, and we're talking about the fact that this one covenant from Genesis chapter 12 unlocks the whole Bible. And we've taken a tour of the Bible of only some of the passages that have a bearing on the covenant with Abraham. And we've shown how the minute you understand who Abraham was, what God had promised him, and the minute you understand that God had made that promise and had set the whole history of Israel and the whole history of the Church of Jesus Christ on the foundation of that promise, the minute you understand that, these passages of the Bible make sense. And we've looked at Old Testament passages, we've looked at New Testament passages, and now we're going to look at one of the most famous passages in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, so-called, and somebody called this the Reader's Digest version, abridged version of the whole Bible, and that's a pretty accurate thing. In fact, you could say that of the book of Hebrews as a whole. It's the whole Bible in one letter. So we're going to look here at verse 8, but I want you to notice how the chapter begins. Because we're going to answer this question, how did Abraham know that he would return with Isaac? And the answer to that question is at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11 with a definition of faith. Now here you're going to see in real time a pastor exert just monumental self-control. I am going to stay on track in this sermon. I am not going to follow all of the temptations to preach every detail that I wish I could preach. But here we go. Watch this. Now, faith is the assurance, substance of things hoped for. Hypostasis is the word there. Substance means faith is the real, it's the real being of things that are hoped for. That's something of the word substance, philosophical term. And there are lots of things that we could say about that word. You'll notice I'm not saying them. But here, he is saying that faith, as we have it as individuals and as a church, faith is a kind of being. It's a real thing. It is the real existence of things that you hope for. And he adds to that faith is the conviction, and I would even say, along with older translations, the evidence of things not seen. So there are things in the future that you cannot see. There are things happening right now that you cannot see. Faith is your contact with those things. Faith is the substance. It's where you meet unseen realities. Now you say, why are you so emphasizing this? Because, like with so many things, our view of faith is messed up. We think in terms of leaps of faith. You don't know, but you really want things to be true, so you just believe for no reason. And that's very often what we mean by faith. And a lot of Christian churches would be guilty of teaching faith in faith. If you believe hard enough, if you want it bad enough, if you don't doubt, if you drive every question out of your mind, and you just believe, it will happen to you just the way you believe. But of course, if you doubt, if you don't believe or don't believe enough, if you entertain those doubts, well, it's probably not going to happen to you. So when you don't see the things that you want to happen, there's always this question, did I believe enough? Did I have enough faith? And I'm emphasizing the way Hebrews defines faith here because I want to say to you categorically, faith is not a leap in the dark for no reason. Faith is not the abandonment of thinking. There isn't logic on one side and faith on the other. Faith is a kind of thinking. Faith is a kind of reasoning. How did Abraham know that Isaac would return with him? How did he know? He thought it through. That's why. That's how he knew. He had faith. So, with that definition in mind, all you're looking at in Hebrews chapter 11 is a bunch of examples of people doing that. So the concept of faith in Hebrews 11 isn't believing things, sort of passively and sort of desiring things, really wanting them, maybe even praying for them. Faith in Hebrews 11 is action. It's people doing stuff that might not make any sense until you understood why they did it. They had reasons for doing it. So we're in the middle of this chapter here in verse 8, looking at lots of different examples of people doing this kind of action. And we've already had a kind of warning in verse 6. You know, God requires faith. He requires that action of you to look at the things that you can see and think it through and say, there are things I can't see. There are things I don't know. There's another reality out there, and it's just as real as the things that I can see. In fact, it's more real. And if I think this through and take action based on what God has called me to do, then I will please God. Verse 6 says, without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, that he rewards those who seek him. You have to make a judgment call in your life that God is real and that if you seek him, he rewards you. That's not something that you can see. And it's not something that this world affirms. If you ask somebody, does God exist? You've got a pretty good chance of somebody saying, well, I don't know. You've got a slim chance of somebody saying, absolutely not. No, God doesn't exist. But those people are out there. If you ask people, does God reward those who seek him? If you look out in the world at things that you can see, is there evidence that he rewards people who seek him? Well, it's doubtful. You have to think differently about this. You have to look at the things you cannot see. You have to think about those. So we've already had that warning. Here's verse 8. 4 actions connected in Hebrews with Abraham. First one. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. So, this is Genesis chapter 12. The Lord says, get out of your father's house, leave your country, and go to the place that I will show you, and I will give you that land as an inheritance. And so what do we have here? We've got everything that Abraham can see, his father's house, the place he lives, it's a nice place, the wealth that he has, and he is supposed to go to a place that that God promises him he will receive as an inheritance, and he can't see it, and he can't see the God telling him to do it. So go. And by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. Now watch this. He went out not knowing where he was going. Didn't have a map. Didn't have the location. All he had was the Lord saying, I will show you, and I will give that land to you as an inheritance. and it will be the seat of your nation, and you will be a blessing to all the earth. So it says he didn't know any of this. He couldn't see any of it. By faith, verse 9, he went to live in the land of promise. Watch that word. It's very important. A promise is a guarantee. It's made to you, and it's not the final giving of the thing promised. It's saying, I'll give this to you. You don't have it yet, but I will give it. So he goes to this land, the land of promise, and he lives there as in a foreign land, living in tents. So everything that he can see tells him you're an alien here. You don't belong here. You don't have any people here. You don't have any land here. Why does he stay? Because God told him, I will give it to you. It will be your inheritance, and you will be, from this land, a blessing to all nations. So it says he was living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, his son and his grandson, heirs with him of the same promise. And why was he doing it? What reason did he have? For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is who? God. He looks at the land that he's in, the tents that he's living in, and he says, this is all about something in the future. There's another city. That's why God told me to do this. So I'm looking forward to that city. And I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to live here. And it's interesting, notice this, that it says he lived with Isaac and Jacob. Well, he was gone by the time Jacob showed up, but he was still there with his sons and grandsons, living in that land, living this life of a sojourner. So the life of faith here, exhibited by Abraham, in the action that he took in going to this land is, I will believe God for what I cannot see. I will believe him because he told me. It's that simple. Here's another one. Verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Now you say, I don't know. This seems like really a stretch, because if you really look at Sarah, she's a piece of work, that lady. She connives with Abraham to get a child through the slave girl Hagar, and they take that child from her, and they live this way, and then she's mad because Abraham did that with Hagar, and they drive Hagar out, and later on, and so forth. And so it's just instance after instance. When God shows up in Genesis 17 and says, you will have a son in a year, Sarah laughs. And so we look at all of this and we say, at what point did Sarah have faith? Because it sure doesn't look like she had any. Well, we're not going to go there. This is another instance of miraculous self-control on the pastor's part. But if you were to go to Genesis 21, you would see a tectonic shift in relationship. Up to that point, the Lord has been dealing with Abraham. But in Genesis 21, the shift is the Lord visited Sarah. Now he's dealing with her. And when he deals with her in that moment and she conceives, it's because she believes the promise and she says so. She says, who would have thought this would ever be possible? But God did this for me. So, Hebrews, pulling out that moment in her life and saying, that's what happened. He came and she believed, and that's how she received the power to conceive. So what is this? This is a woman saying, everything I've experienced, everything I can see tells me that I'm not going to have a child. God says, I will have a child. Therefore, I will have a child. See the reasoning here? What you see is not necessarily reality. Reality is what you cannot see. And the way you apprehend that reality is by trusting what God says. So that's a second action. And what were the results of that? Verse 12, therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore, evoking the language of Genesis 15 and other passages, saying, God did it. He did exactly what he said he would do. But the people at the time didn't see it. Here's the third action that we're going to look at here connected with Abraham. And this action is an action that Abraham did, Sarah did, Isaac and Jacob did it, and many others. But at this moment, the writer to Hebrews says, you know, they all did this. Every single one of the people who followed the Lord did this. And you need to do it. You're doing it right now, and you need to do it more. You need to learn this more. These all died in faith, verse 13. They died. They died in faith. They had the promise. They had the things that they could see, but they did not have the tangible reality of the thing promised, and they died. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were aliens, they were strangers and exiles on the earth. What is he saying? These people thought different. They were built different. They didn't look at the things they could see. Together, they looked at the things God told them about. They said, those things are true, and even if we die without having received that city, it's still there, and we still believe it. And what he's saying here is, this is you. And this is not just you as individuals. This is you corporately, church. These are the things that God has called you to do in faith, because without faith it is impossible to please him. For people who speak thus, verse 14, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. They weren't looking backwards at the things they knew and the things they could see. They were looking ahead to things they couldn't see. We're aliens here. We're strangers. We're immigrants. We're wandering around without a home. Verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, watch this closely. God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared for them a city. Think that through. God has made promises to us as a church, as American Christians, here as BG. He's made promises to us as Christians in this world at this moment. And he has said to us, essentially, do you believe me or not? Are you with me? Do you trust me? And when his church says, yes, we trust you, we really are kind of homeless here. We're looking for something better. We're looking for something more secure, because there is no security here. We don't own anything here. Then God looks at his church and says, yep, you are my people. Without faith, it is impossible to please me. But with faith, I am pleased. That is what I ask. I ask for your trust, because what you can see will trick you. And if you are wise enough to believe what I say about what you cannot see, you won't be tricked. And I'm with you. And so what he's exhorting the church in the first century to do here in particular is in the persecution that they are dreading and hasn't happened yet. He says, stay faithful. Stay faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ. Know that you have a better city. Don't shrink back now. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, even when everything that you're looking at tells you that you're wrong, and that God is wrong, and that nothing he has said is real. Beloved, let's get real. Every church in America is looking back today. There was a better time. There was a better decade. And every church in America right now is in a state of temptation, saying, well, the best things are back there. And maybe we can recover them, maybe we can't. But from what we can see, everything's getting worse. From everything we can see, our country is sliding into decay, and the churches face an uncertain future. Things are coming that are dangerous, and we better just hunker down. Beloved, it says, if those people in past generations had been looking back to the better thing, they would have had opportunity to return. And I will tell you that many Christians in America will return. They will build a little fantasy world around them to evoke the better days. And they'll go back there, and that's where they'll live. And that is where they will die. And many churches will die this way, but not this one. Because we believe in the God who knows the things we cannot see. And we believe that he is good for his promises. And we are called to do that. We are called to do it in the face of political realities, cultural realities, financial realities. We are called to do it in the face of a feeling of discouragement. Everything that you can see is arguing against this church doing what God has called it to do. Everything. You have to choose. Are you going to trust what you see, or are you going to trust God? This is a corporate decision. All of us as individuals can believe God as individuals, but we are called to act together. We are called to act corporately in faith. So, that's the kind of exhortation that the author to the Hebrews is giving the first century church, and he makes it to them so that we would read it and receive that same exhortation ourselves. Here's the fourth action that we're going to look at this morning by Abraham. Verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested. So now we're in Genesis 22. We're at those first 5 verses. And those verses say that God commanded him to offer up his only son, whom he loved. Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He did it. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." So he takes us right back to that moment where the knife is raised and the blood is going to flow. That moment. And the author to the Hebrews says Abraham was ready to do it because of a reason. He didn't do it blindly. He didn't do it as a leap in the dark. He had thought it through. Here's his thinking, verse 19. He considered, what about that word? Considered. This doesn't mean Abraham had an ecstatic, mystical experience, and so he was trusting that experience and depending upon that in order to inform his way forward. There's a lot of teaching about that kind of thing too, that you have an experience, a vision, a prophecy or something, and that's what you're supposed to do. No, it says he considered. The word is reckoned. He added it up. He mathed good. He considered, he reckoned that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back, because there was a substitute sacrifice, and you know the story. The angel stops him from killing Isaac, supplies the sacrifice to save the life of Isaac. And remember, this is all of Israel now, all bound up in their father, Isaac. Israel is on that altar. Israel deserves to die, just as every human being does. But the substitute is supplied by God and saves the life of Isaac and saves Israel from the wrath of God, and the promise goes forward. You know what this is saying? Abraham thought it through. He reckoned it up. And he said, God promised that through this boy, my offspring would be reckoned. Now, I have tried God on that promise for 100 years. Again and again and again. I have believed him, I have backslid and defied him. I have brought my family into crisis defying him. And he has still kept this promise. And when he said that my barren, century-old wife would have this child, she did. And so he says, sacrifice the child through whom your offspring will be reckoned. I'll get him back because they will be reckoned through this child. Period. What is he doing? He is reasoning about things that he cannot see based on what God has said. And he has lined up his experience with what God said. And he said, you know, in 100 years, everything God has said was true. So I don't know how this is going to happen, but he is able to raise him from the dead. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 2 of my young men along on this journey, and I'm going to stop them at a certain spot, and I'm going to tell them in advance that we, the boy and I, are going to go up there and worship, and we, the boy and I, are going to come back to you. and they will witness what God did. How did Abraham know? Why was he so certain? He thought about it. He reasoned through believing God's promises. Question to you: are you in a place in life where God is calling you to do that in a fresh way? You may say, yeah, I did that years ago. I did that last year. It worked out great. I've got a testimony. I'd love to share it with you. I'm asking you, is God putting you in the place where you need to do this again? Repeatedly throughout life, we are brought to the place where we have to think through what is real. Am I going to be tricked by the things I can see, or am I going to believe the things I can't see, that heavenly city that I can't see yet? Am I going to believe the promises of God about those unseen things, or am I just going to go with my limited ability to navigate the reality around me? This is a tough process. People, I love this, people think faith is a crutch. If it's such a crutch, then why are we all having to work so hard to keep it? Because we do. We have to work very hard every day to believe God. Every day, a new reason to chuck the whole thing. Every day, a new reason to say, well, it's over for this ministry or that ministry. Every day. If faith is such an easy crutch for the deluded, how come we're all working so hard at this? And we are. I'm telling you from Hebrews chapter 11 and from the whole Bible and the example of Abraham, that work that you're doing to believe God and his promises is not in vain. It's your salvation. That work that you're doing to believe God for the things you cannot see, that work pleases God. And from heaven's throne, he is saying, I'm with them. Because that is the work that Abraham did. He is an example of how to do this, and that example runs through the whole Bible. But Abraham is also one of our best reasons for faith. What we're saying is not that we're taking a shot in the dark, a blind leap of faith. We're saying God promised Abraham thousands of years ago, and he kept those promises, and he kept them, and he worked with his people to keep them in faith, keep them believing him. We have that whole record, and as we have joined that story of believing God for the things we cannot see, as he has worked with us, we see promise after promise called into being, like the dead brought to life. And over again, we have seen that God is true and that what he declares is real. And that's why we believe him. And by faith, we please God. Let me close this sermon in this series with this exhortation that really closes Hebrews chapter 11, and this is Hebrews 12:1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Abraham among them, Sarah among them, Isaac among them, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, those two young men whose names we don't know are in that cloud of witnesses. Let us also, Lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. What he could see was death. What he could not see was the promise of God to raise him to life. So he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus went before us doing this very thing and doing it perfectly.